I want to talk today about the president's recent dealings with Iran and the serious questions the administration's actions have raised. Let me begin by saying, first of all, that I welcome, as do all Americans who've been watching this, the release of the 3 American hostages that were wrongfully detained in Iran. We are all glad to see the return of Pastor Saeed Abedini, of Jason Rezaian, of Amir Hekmati, that they've been freed, they've been reunited with their families is an important thing. Our prayers, my prayers, the prayers of so many Americans remain with those families and with the family of Robert Levinson, a former FBI employee that we have not been given the kind of information about that we need to have. And if he is alive, we should demand his release. If he's not alive, we should demand to find out what happened to Robert Levinson. The U.S., in return for these 3 hostages being released 7 Iranians or Iranian Americans who'd been convicted of transferring technology, and that included, Mr. President, nuclear dual-use technology to Iran. The administration also agreed to take 14 Iranians off the Interpol arrest list as part of this effort to get Americans unfairly held back. And if clearing the way for 21 convicted or indicted enemies of the United States wasn't enough, then the United States, in my view, also agreed to pay $1.7 billion to Iran. In everybody's view, they paid that $1.7 billion at the time of the swap. The administration, I guess, would want us to believe it's just coincidental that the day after the American hostages were released and the day after the Iran deal went into effect, Secretary Kerry announced that the United States had settled a claim at The Hague, the World Court at The Hague, had settled a claim at The Hague dating back decades. According to the Wall Street Journal, an Iranian general, Raza Nagy, said, taking this money back, this is a quote, taking this money back was in return for the release of the American spies and doesn't have anything to do with the nuclear talks. Now, whether it had something to do with the nuclear talks or not, I don't know how significant that is. I introduced an amendment when we were debating the Iran agreement that it shouldn't be finalized in any way until all of these hostages were returned. Now, in fairness, I didn't think it should be finalized in any way, no matter what, but I definitely couldn't understand why we wouldn't insist that these innocently held Americans were returned. It becomes more and more obvious all the time that the Iranians had a plan. Not only did they want to further humiliate the United States, but they just simply wanted money. Under the settlement, this settlement at The Hague, the United States will be paying Iran and has already paid Iran $1.7 billion. This is supposedly $400 million in principal, stemming back to a former military sale before the fall of the Shah of Iran, and then $1.3 billion in interest. $400 million in principal, $1.3 billion in interest. The timing of the swap and the announcement of the breakthrough in the settlement, a settlement that had been, this had been at the World Court for 35 years. 35 years, and we're supposed to believe that it's just another coincidence in the Obama State Department. Peeling back the details of this settlement's even more troubling because the money had already been spent. This was Iranian money from a foreign military sale that had been held in what's called the FMS account, the foreign military sale account. It was originally placed in that trust fund, but then it was spent. Now, why was it spent? It was spent because the Congress in 2000 passed legislation that the president signed that directed the Secretary of the Treasury to use that money to compensate victims of Iranian terrorism. In cases like Flatall versus Iran and 4 other related cases, Iranian terror victims all received compensation from this fund, effectively wiping out the balance of the fund. The trust fund that the administration is referring to has already been spent. How do you give money back that's already been spent? You can't give money back that's already been spent. I suppose you can take taxpayer dollars, which is what happened here. You can take taxpayer dollars, suggest that somehow this was the money of the Iranians all the time, and give them those taxpayer dollars to Iran in return for, as their own general said, the release of the people he called the American spies. Now, did the administration essentially agree to ransom to get these Americans released? It certainly appears so. And Mr. President, I think you and I and every member of the Senate should continue pressing the administration for answers. If they want to spend taxpayer money, there may be some legal way they can do that, but there's really no legal way they can say they're giving money back that the Congress already told them to do something else with, and they did. In addition to that money, of course, that we've now given to Iran, the Iranian agreement allows somewhere between $100 and $150 million held by countries all over the world since the late 1970s to be returned to Iran. And just last week, the Secretary of State Kerry, said that some of this money will, and I'm going to quote him, quote, end up in the hands of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and other entities, some of which are labeled terrorist. Well, of course, that's where that money is going to wind up. There was an argument made during the Iranian agreement, well, there are so many needs in Iran that they're going to spend this on other more worthwhile things. But no matter how many needs there were in Iran, Iran is, by the administration's own determination, the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And of course, when you give them money back, they're going to use that money for what they're already using their money for. They're just going to have over $100 billion more dollars that they have at their disposal. The world's largest state spare of terrorism, whether it's backing Palestinian terrorists in Gaza or supporting Hezbollah's attacks against Israel from Lebanon, the regime will now have more resources to do that with. Iran, of course, has made no secret of its nuclear ambitions nor its willingness to flout the treaty obligations in order to achieve those ambitions. It recently launched 2 ballistic missile tests in the last 3 months, a direct violation of the UN Security Council resolution which prohibits them from engaging in these activities related to ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, but they've done it twice in the last 90 days. Even members of the president's own party that have supported the Iran agreement have criticized the administration's lack of response to these violations. What's the world to think? What are the American people to think when we're transferring money at the time we get American hostages back, that we're allowing missiles to be launched over the U.S., near the USS Harry Truman, when we're allowing ballistic missile tests to occur, and acting as if we've made some great breakthrough with Iran. The recent detention of U.S. sailors in Iran is just another example of how little we've gained in this Iranian policy agreement. The administration's gone out of its way to accommodate the demands of this regime that is hostile, that it sponsors terrorists. Enough is enough, Mr. President. It's time that the Congress stood up, and I urge my colleagues in the Senate to utilize every tool at our disposal to hold the Iranian regime accountable. One important step would be to secure Iranian assets owed to victims of terrorism who've been awarded judgments by our courts and other courts Why would we give money to Iran when there are Americans who are victims of terrorism that courts have said have a right to that money? They found Iran liable for sponsoring fatal attacks against American citizens, including the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Embassy and the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, and the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers in Khobar, Saudi Arabia. According to the Congressional Research Service, about $43.5 billion in unpaid judgments from Iran to Americans are due. Iran should not receive any sanctions relief until those claims have been paid. And we ought to look at how we can secure Iranian assets to provide some measure of victims of these terrorist activities. And that should include assets held by foreign countries, foreign companies and countries who do business in the United States. The idea that the Iranian regime is now our partner is dangerously naive, and one that undermines our global leadership. It confuses our friends, it emboldens our enemies. I urge the president to quit bending to this regime and start putting the interest of the American people and our allies first, and I urge the Congress to continue to look at this recent exchange of money for hostages.